Here we're going to talk about the basics of incomplete contracts and introducing these ideas in Chapter 10. So, what are the main ideas in the chapter? Firstly, we're going to ask the question, what are the differences between complete and incomplete contracts? So, in order to understand that, we have to understand what the different attributes of contracts are and what has made contracts complete in other models that we've discussed previously. Then we're going to talk about principal-agent relationships and conflicts of interest. Here we're going to have to talk about people who are in the role of the principal, people who are in the role of the agent, and what the conflict of interest is between the two of them in terms of the goals that they have. We're going to talk about hidden attributes and hidden actions. And these are going to be sources of contractual incompleteness. And this has got to do with asymmetric information, which you've learned about before, and whether someone might hide the actions that they have from a principal that they're interacting with, or whether someone might hide their characteristics, their attributes from another person that they're interacting with. So with hidden actions, principals, for example, set prices and agents receive a rent. The market does not clear, and the outcome is Pareto inefficient. So the important thing here is that we're going to see that in a variety of circumstances with incomplete contracts, you get markets that do not clear, so supply does not equal demand, or quantity supply does not equal quantity demanded. The outcome is also going to be Pareto inefficient, and there are alternative Pareto superior outcomes that the people involved in the exchange are unable to obtain. Okay, so what else are we thinking about? Well, when contracts are incomplete, it's often the case that social norms and the exercise of power by principals can facilitate mutually beneficial exchange. What do we mean by this? When we have interactions between principals and agents, often those interactions are going to be repeated over time between a worker and an employer, between a lender and a borrower, between a subcontractor and someone paying for the contract. When that happens, and these occur over time, we get these things called contingent renewal contracts. I will renew my contract with you contingent on or conditional upon you producing a certain level of quality, of effort, or ensuring that you behave in a way consistent with what I expect. Now what that means then is if I'm doing this and drawing up the contract, I am going to be exercising power over you when I'm the principal and you are the agent. Now, when that happens, this allows contracts to exist in the first place, but it also means that only some agents get contracts and other agents do not. Another thing that happens is that when you have these repeated interactions over time, it's often going to be the case that some agents are going to establish social norms with other principals such that they, for example, trust each other. When I trust you and you trust me, you maybe don't need to supervise me as intensely. And that can result in Pareto superior outcomes occurring that are better than the Nash equilibrium. Now, what we also are going to have to think about is that there's going to be a conflict of interest, and that the relationship between the principal and the agent is going to provide us with information about the distribution of benefits. So, depending on the characteristics of the contract and the characteristics of the relationship between the principal and the agent, there can be more or less beneficial distributions for the different parties involved. We're also going to see how the nature of the contract is going to affect aspects such as trust in these repeated interactions that I've already described. So, we're going to start with an example, which is red winter wheat number 2 and the Chicago Board of Trade. So red winter wheat number 2 is a kind of wheat that exists, and it exists because the Chicago Board of Trade turned wheat into a commodity. Now, what do we mean by that? A commodity is something you can simply buy with an expectation of the level of quality that it has. So the important thing here is that for a farmer, there's no real thing like wheat, right? They're thinking about the different kinds of brands of wheat and the different kinds of characteristics of wheat that might exist. And what you also want to think of here, right, is that if you were previously someone who was making bread or like 100 or so years ago, right, and you were thinking here, okay, right, I want to buy wheat in order to make flour, in order to make bread. You would perhaps have a relationship with a farmer, and you would know that farmer A's wheat was a certain kind of wheat, farmer B's wheat was a different kind of wheat, farmer C's wheat was another kind of wheat. And depending on what you were trying to do, you might interact with different farmers differently. And you might be willing to pay different prices for different amounts of wheat. Now, what the Chicago Board of Trade did was that it adopted classifications and policies to create homogeneous categories of grain and to facilitate transactions between anonymous participants. It was no longer the case that I needed to know that farmer A produced a certain kind of wheat, farmer B produced another one, farmer C was maybe similar to A and different to B in different ways. I could just know that I could buy red winter wheat number 2. It didn't matter who it was coming from. It was certified by the Chicago Board of Trade as a certain kind of wheat. So in this way, the kinds of grains have become homogeneous, homogeneous, and these traders can write enforceable and complete contracts when they buy them. This is often the case with certain kinds of agricultural products. Because of the categorization by organizations like the Chicago Board of Trade, I know that if I'm buying some red winter wheat number 2 for a certain number of tons, for example, or a certain number of bushels of wheat, bushels are measurement of wheat, right? That I am guaranteed a certain level of quality. And the Chicago Board of Trade is enforcing this. Now, that applies to certain kinds of commodities like this in agricultural production. Now, here's a question. What other markets can you think of where goods are homogeneous or homogeneous or standardized, right? What are the processes that exist in order to facilitate that kind of standardization or homogenization? Does it simply exist? Are there agreements that we come to in order to understand them as more or less homogeneous, more or less standardized? How does that work? Well, apart from making a good homogeneous, what other ways can we think of to reduce the uncertainty over the quality of a good in certain ways? Well, this is really important, right? When I'm trying to buy a good, when you're trying to buy a good, we want to understand the level of quality of that good. In so doing, we're trying to think through what quality we want when we purchase a good. Is it mediocre quality but at a low price, in which case it's acceptable? Are we paying a high price and therefore we want high quality for that good? Are we wanting to understand whether it's going to last a long time? These kinds of things. Is it durable? So these kinds of aspects of quality are often hard to contract for, but we're quite inventive as humans, and so we come up with ways to try to understand what quality is and hold things to certain standards, even when it's hard to establish what quality is in a variety of different ways. Now, we're going to unpack what we can do here in different parts in this chapter. We're going to talk about reputation systems, for example, rating systems when it comes to later in the chapter, and how those can maybe make contracts a little more complete when interactions are not repeated. Think about goods that you or services that you're accustomed to using. Maybe use Uber or Lyft or similar things. What do you do in that interaction? You rate them, they rate you. What do you do when you buy something from Etsy or another online store? There are also different kinds of rating systems that people might use in order to reinforce the use of and facilitation of exchange in different anonymous markets. Now, these ideas about the completeness of contracts, the information that makes an exchange have quality that is assured in a certain way, that can be bought in a commodified fashion, as in just a weight. I can buy 1 ton of wheat, this amount of fish, this amount of another homogeneous good. In those contexts, these things have complete contracts, and I can just purchase these things without worrying who I'm buying it from. But we're also going to see that it's most likely the case that many contracts are incomplete. We have unverifiable information, and that results in a variety of different problems that we have to solve.